I have a pair of Matuto Toyo dial calipers from 1998, stainless steel. They have a small, almost invisible scratch near the 2-inch mark, a scar from a dropped wrench a decade ago, but they still read true to the thousandth of a millimeter. When you work with metal your whole adult life, you learn very quickly that precision is not just a technical skill, it is a survival trait. If you are off by a fraction of a hair, the machine vibrates. If it vibrates, it fractures. If it fractures, the whole system eventually falls apart violently. People, I have found, are a lot like that. I just never expected the fracture in my own life to come from the boy I practically raised as my own son. He thought he was taking my life's work out from under me. He thought he was the smartest guy in the room because he knew how to talk to venture capitalists and use words like paradigm, synergy, and scalability. But he forgot one very simple rule about the man who taught him how to hold a wrench in the first place. I measure twice, I cut once, and when I finally make the cut, I do not miss. Welcome to the channel. Before we get into today's story, if you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you, genuinely. My name is Marcus. I am 62 years old, and for the last 35 of those years, I have breathed in the smell of cutting fluid, ozone, and hot steel in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I build things. Specifically, I design high-pressure fluid dynamic systems. Industrial valving, the kind of heavy, unglamorous components that go deep underground into pipelines or high into the atmosphere, places where mechanical failure is simply not an option. It is very quiet, methodical work. You spend hours alone in a shop, listening to the steady rhythmic hum of a CNC lathe. You watch the metal curl off the cutting tool in long, smoking silver ribbons. It demands patience. It demands a respect for the physical laws of the universe. My older brother, Thomas, was not a patient man. He was a salesman. He was a charmer, a man who lived on credit and promises. And when he passed away 12 years ago, from a sudden massive heart attack, he left behind a messy mountain of debts and a 19-year-old son named David. David had his father's easy smile and his father's dangerous impatience. I did not have children of my own. My life was my shop. So I did what you do when your family needs you. I stepped up. I brought him in. I paid for his business degree out of my own pocket. I gave him a job sweeping the heavy concrete floors of my shop, hoping to teach him the ground floor of the business I had built from absolutely nothing. I wanted him to understand the grit and the grease before he understood the profit margins. David was smart. I will gladly give him that. He absorbed information like a dry sponge, but he never really respected the physical work we did. He would stand in the shop, checking his phone, wearing a suit that cost more than my first truck, looking at my veteran machinists like they were museum exhibits from a forgotten era. He didn't see craftsmanship. He saw overhead. He saw inefficiencies. But I loved the kid. I really did. I thought his raw ambition was just youth. I thought he would eventually settle into the heavy reality of the work. Over the years, I moved him from the shop floor to the front office. By the time he was 28, he was my vice president of operations, and honestly, he was good at it. He streamlined our supply chain, brought in lucrative new clients, and made the company look sleek and modern on paper. We grew fast. My company, Horizon Dynamics, went from a respected regional supplier to a serious player on the national board. I let him be the public face of the company while I stayed in the back, in the R&D lab, doing what I actually loved. That was my first major mistake. I confused his capability with loyalty. Fine is a word that sounds like a compliment, but isn't. Everything was fine, right up until the day it completely wasn't. The catalyst for the fracture was a new project. We called it the Apex valve. It was a revolutionary pressure regulation system designed specifically for next-generation geothermal power plants. It was engineered to handle extreme heat and pressure variances without failing or needing maintenance for decades. It was the absolute crown jewel of my career. I spent 4 grueling years designing it. The math behind the fluid dynamics was beautiful. the way certain storms are beautiful. But it was incredibly complex. It required a very specific, proprietary internal cooling mechanism to prevent the seals from melting under maximum thermal load. I shared the early schematics with David. His eyes lit up immediately, but not at the engineering marvel of it. He saw a massive buyout. He saw Silicon Valley venture capital money. He started talking about taking the company public, about securing massive funding rounds, about scaling up global production, before we even had a fully working physical prototype. I told him no. I told him we needed at least 2 more years of rigorous stress testing. You do not rush high-pressure systems. You rush them, things break, and people get hurt. That was when the air in the building started to change. I have a very good friend named Elias. We've known each other for 30 years. Elias is an intellectual property attorney who drinks his coffee black from a chipped, ugly ceramic mug he's had since law school. He is a cynic by trade and a brutal realist by nature. We meet for breakfast every other Tuesday at a small diner on Wealthy Street. About a year ago, over cold wheat toast and bitter coffee, Elias looked at me over the rim of his mug. He told me he really didn't like the way David was structuring our new board of directors. I had let David bring in some external advisors to help guide our expansion. Elias warned me that these men weren't advisors. They were corporate sharks, and David was throwing chum in the water to attract them. I brushed it off. I told Elias he was being a paranoid lawyer. I told him David was my blood. Elias just set his mug down on the table. The silence sat like a fifth guest at our booth. He looked out the window and said, "Marcus, family is just a comfortable word for the people who know exactly where to slide the knife." I should have listened to him. 6 months later, the Apex valve was entering its final digital simulation phase. I was working late one night, around 2:11 a.m. The machine shop was entirely empty. Just me, the low hum of the overhead ventilation, and a single desk lamp illuminating my blueprints. I was reviewing the thermal stress data on version 3.8 of the prototype. The data was bad. Under sustained maximum pressure, the heat dissipation failed entirely. The core temperature spiked rapidly, and in a real-world scenario, the valve would warp, lock up, and eventually burst. It was a critical, fatal flaw. I noted the exact failure points in my private leather-bound journal and started working on the solution. A completely new bypass chamber design, but I didn't update the central company servers right away. I like to work out the heavy math on paper first, before digitizing it. It is an old habit of mine. The very next morning, I walked into the main conference room for what I thought was a routine operations meeting. David was there. So were the 5 new board members he had brought in. They were all wearing sharp, tailored suits. I was wearing my steel-toed work boots and a faded flannel shirt, smelling faintly of machine grease. David didn't look me in the eye when I walked in. His jaw was doing that thing. That slow, rhythmic grinding thing he does when he's nervous or about to lie. He slid a thick, legally bound folder across the polished oak table toward me. He told me that the board had taken an emergency vote that morning. He told me that my stubborn insistence on delaying the Apex valve was costing the company tens of millions in potential immediate investment. He told me that I was holding Horizon Dynamics back from its true potential. The specific words he used were relic, bottleneck, and outdated leadership. He had secretly secured a 51% majority vote from the board he built. He was forcing me out of the company I built with my bare hands, my own nephew. He finally looked at me across that long table, his hands folded perfectly in front of him, and he said, "It's nothing personal, Uncle Marcus. It's just the future." Nobody said anything for a while. The silence had weight to it. I looked at the 5 men my nephew had brought in to orchestrate my execution. They were assembled from a catalog of corporate raiders. Perfect hair, expensive watches, and absolutely zero calluses on their hands. They sat with perfect posture, completely insulated from the reality of the machinery that paid for their tailored suits. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I just reached into my faded flannel shirt pocket, pulled out my reading glasses, and read the severance document David had pushed across the polished oak table. It was cold, It was incredibly clinical. They were offering me a buyout that was essentially a fraction of my own company's actual valuation, claiming that without the Apex valve launched into the market, Horizon Dynamics was financially stagnant. They were legally executing a hostile takeover, leveraging a loophole in the corporate bylaws David had quietly restructured over the past 18 months. "You're making a mistake, David," I said, just once. Quietly. "I'm making us rich, Uncle Marcus," he replied, his voice painfully steady, though his eyes kept darting to the mahogany walls, avoiding my gaze. "I'm sorry. Security is waiting outside to escort you to your office. You have 1 hour to clear out your personal effects. We need your server access keys immediately." I went very, very quiet. I didn't argue. I didn't throw a tantrum. I just took out my pen, a heavy brass bolt-action pen I machined myself 10 years ago, and I signed the acknowledgement of termination. I did not sign the financial buyout agreement. I folded that document and put it in my pocket. I went down to my office. I didn't pack much. A framed photograph of my brother Thomas, looking young and arrogant, standing next to me in front of our very first rented garage workspace. My leather-bound engineering journal, where I kept my daily notes, and my Matuto calipers. I left the industry awards, the polished brass plaques, the customized pen sets the vendors had given me over the years. They were just heavy metal. They didn't mean anything. I walked out through the main shop floor. The heavy CNC lathes were silent. The machinists, men I had worked alongside for a decade, guys whose kids' college tuitions I had helped pay for, just stood there. They didn't know what to say. They had just been informed via a mass corporate email that there was a change in leadership. I looked at Frank, my lead foreman. His hand was still frozen on the table of the milling machine. I held up one hand. Just one. A silent goodbye. I walked out to the parking lot, got into my 1998 Ford F-150, and I sat in my car for a while. I didn't drive. I just stared at the worn leather of the steering wheel. Something in my chest did a thing it had never done before. It wasn't just anger. Anger is hot and burns out quickly. This was a cold, hollow echo where my family used to be. It was the realization that the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle had just efficiently and ruthlessly cut my throat for a venture capital payout. I started the truck. I drove straight to Elias's office in downtown Grand Rapids. His office smells exactly the same as it did in neat 1990 old paper, floor wax, and expensive bourbon. I sat in the cracked leather chair opposite his desk and told him exactly what had happened. I told him about the emergency board vote, the 51% majority trap, the security escort, and David's refusal to look me in the eye. Elias listened. He took a slow sip of his black coffee from that chipped ceramic mug. He didn't offer empty sympathies. He didn't tell me it was going to be okay. He is far too good a friend for that kind of lie. "Did you sign the separation agreement and the buyout?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "I signed the termination of duties," I said. "I kept the buyout paperwork." "Good," Elias said, setting his mug down. "Now tell me about the intellectual property. What exactly do they have on their servers right now? What did David actually steal?" Here's the thing about corporate takeovers, led by finance guys. They do not understand the anatomy of what they are stealing. They just look at the file names. They look at the digital footprint. David had locked me out of the central server the moment the board meeting started. He had seized all the CAD files, the testing data, and the blueprints for the Apex valve. He thought he had the Holy Grail locked in a digital vault. "They have version 3.8, I told Elias. Elias raised a thick gray eyebrow. "Is version 3.8 the functional prototype?" "No," I said, leaning forward. "Version 3.8 has a fatal thermal retention flaw. If you run superheated steam through it at anything over 450 degrees Fahrenheit for more than 20 minutes, the internal housing expands faster than the release seals. It will warp. The pressure will back up into the main line. It will fail violently." Elias leaned back in his chair. The old wood creaked loudly in the quiet room. "And where is the fix for this fatal flaw, Marcus?" "In my head," I said, "and in this leather journal. I placed the book on his desk. I designed a titanium bypass chamber 2 nights ago. It reroutes the thermal load. It equalizes the expansion rate. It solves the problem entirely. I never digitized it. It has never touched a Horizon Dynamics computer. It doesn't exist anywhere except on these pages. Elias almost smiled. Almost. Which, if you know me, is the closest thing to a miracle. Marcus, he said softly, drumming his fingers on his desk. Do you remember the specific wording of your founder's contract? The one I drafted for you 35 years ago, before David was even born? I measured twice. I cut once, I replied. I remember. Elias nodded. There is no intellectual property clause claiming company ownership of non-digitized, non-prototyped concepts residing solely in the founder's physical possession post-termination. If you file a patent for that bypass chamber today, as an independent entity, Horizon Dynamics has zero legal claim to it. They own a flawed, dangerous valve. You own the only breathing apparatus that stops it from choking to death. I went very, very quiet. I looked at the old grandfather clock, ticking in the corner of his office. I thought about David grinding his jaw. I thought about the men in the suits who had never held a wrench. Draft the patent, Elias, I said. Put it under my name. Expedite it. Over the next 3 months, I watched my nephew parade my company through the business press. It was agonizing, but I forced myself to observe it. I watched him on streaming finance channels, wearing expensive black turtlenecks, talking about disrupting the geothermal energy sector. He announced that Horizon Dynamics was fast-tracking the production of the Apex valve. He fired 3 of my senior machinists, guys who actually knew how metal behaves under stress, and replaced them with a team of young process engineers who looked at computer screens instead of listening to the machines. David was burning through cash, but he was raising it just as fast. He secured a preliminary $12 million funding round from a venture capital firm in California. The only condition for the final release of the funds, the condition that would officially make David a multimillionaire and cement his takeover, was a successful real-world, live stress test demonstration of the Apex valve. They didn't know they were building version 3.8. They just downloaded the latest files from my R&D folder, sent them to a rapid prototyping manufacturing firm in Ohio, and ordered a functional model built out of solid industrial steel. Cleverness is fast. What I do is slow. David didn't bother to run the grueling, weeks-long digital stress simulations that I always mandated. He trusted the file name. He trusted that his uncle had already done the math, and I had. I just hadn't left him the right math. I spent my days in my garage. I bought an old, heavy-duty lathe at an estate auction and restored it to perfect working condition. I spent $14,200 of my own savings prototyping the titanium bypass chamber. I machined it myself, late into the night, letting the smell of cutting fluid remind me of who I was. I filed the patent through Elias. It was locked down tight, watertight. And trust me, when Elias locks something down, it stays locked forever. Then, the invitation arrived. It was a heavy embossed cardstock envelope delivered to my mailbox. It was an invitation to the official Horizon Dynamics Apex Valve Live demonstration and investor gala. It was to be held at an independent, heavily fortified pressure testing facility outside of Detroit. David had invited me. It wasn't an olive branch. I knew him too well for that. It was a victory lap. He wanted the old relic to sit in the audience and watch the new generation secure a massive fortune using the relic's own foundational design. He wanted to look me in the eye when the venture capitalists handed him the check. I didn't know it yet, but that invitation was the biggest mistake he would ever make in his entire life. I called Elias. He picked up on the second ring, the sound of legal briefs rustling in the background. "You got one too?" I asked. "I did," Elias said, his voice completely flat. "Are we going?" I reached into my pocket. My thumb found the small metal gear of my Mitutoyo calipers. I rubbed it slowly, feeling the cold steel. "Yes," I said, "we're going." I wouldn't miss it for the world. The independent testing facility sat on the industrial outskirts of Detroit, a massive, windowless concrete bunker originally built during the Cold War for aerospace stress testing. It was exactly the kind of place that made venture capitalists nervous. There were no sleek glass conference rooms, no artisanal espresso machines, just heavy reinforced steel doors, the sharp smell of ozone, and warning signs painted in stark, faded yellow. I pulled my 1998 Ford F-150 into a parking lot filled with rented black SUVs and imported luxury sedans. Elias climbed out of the passenger seat, adjusting the lapels of his worn tweed jacket. He looked at the line of polished cars, then at the massive concrete structure. "Looks like a tomb, Marcus," Elias muttered. "It is," I said. "Just depends on who's going inside." We walked through the heavy security doors and were ushered into the primary observation deck. It was a large room suspended above the main testing floor, separated by 4 inches of bulletproof, blast-resistant polycarbonate glass. Down below, sitting in the center of the cavernous testing bay like an unexploded bomb, was the apex valve. They had built it out of solid, high-carbon industrial steel. It was beautiful, massive, and hooked up to a terrifying array of high-pressure steam pipes and digital telemetry sensors. The observation room was packed. There were easily 30 people mingling. The venture capital team from California stood in a cluster near the catered food table, wearing their trademark fleece vests over expensive button-down shirts. They were laughing, checking their phones, completely unaware of the terrifying kinetic energy. Sitting just a few yards below them, Elias walked over to the catering table and looked at a tray of miniature quiches like they had personally offended him. Then the crowd parted slightly, and David walked toward us. He looked older than he had 3 months ago. The forced takeover had aged him. He was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit, and his hair was perfectly styled, but there were tight lines around his eyes, and his jaw was doing that slow, rhythmic grinding thing. He stopped about 3 feet from me. He didn't offer his hand. "I'm surprised you actually showed up, Uncle Marcus," David said. His voice was low, modulated for the benefit of the investors nearby. "I thought it might be too difficult for you." Seeing this, I looked at him. I didn't say anything immediately. I just let the silence stretch out. Let it sit between us until he shifted his weight slightly. "I wouldn't miss it, David," I said quietly. "We've made a lot of improvements since you left," he said, gesturing toward the blast glass. "Streamlined the assembly. Cut the production overhead by 22%. The firm is very happy." "Efficiency is a good thing," I replied. "Until it isn't." He frowned, the confident veneer cracking just a fraction. "What does that mean?" "It means I hope your new process engineers ran the thermal retention simulations to the end," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Did they? Of course they did," David snapped, a defensive edge bleeding into his tone. "The data is solid. The VC tech analysts reviewed the CAD files themselves. The math is flawless." "If you say so," I said. I held up one hand. Just one. "Good luck today, David." I turned away from him and walked over to the blast glass, standing next to Elias. I could feel David staring at my back before he turned and hurried toward the lead investor to shake hands. I reached into my pocket and touched the small gear of my calipers. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps if you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this whole thing running, so thank you for real. Down on the testing floor, the head technician raised his hand and signaled the control booth. The room grew quiet as the PA system crackled to life. A disembodied voice announced the commencement of the Phase 3 stress test. The goal was to push superheated steam through the apex valve at a sustained pressure of 1,200 psi, while slowly ramping the internal temperature to a peak of 450 degrees Fahrenheit. It was designed to simulate a catastrophic load spike in a geothermal tap. The venture capitalists stepped up to the glass, holding their branded water bottles, smiling. David stood at the center, looking like a captain at the helm of a very expensive ship. I just watched the metal. The testing rig groaned. It was a deep guttural sound that vibrated through the concrete floor and into the soles of my boots. A digital readout projected on the wall above the testing bay began to climb. Pressure, 400 psi. Temperature, 210 degrees Fahrenheit. Smooth, one of the investors murmured behind me. Pressure, 800 psi. Temperature, 315 degrees Fahrenheit. The heavy steel pipes leading into the valve began to shudder slightly. This was normal. Metal expands. It shifts. You have to give it room to breathe. I watched the external housing of the apex valve, version 3.8. It looked impenetrable, perfectly machined, but I knew exactly what was happening inside. The internal core, subjected to the rapidly escalating heat, was expanding, but without my titanium bypass chamber to route the thermal load, the heat had nowhere to bleed off. It was trapped against the secondary pressure seals. Pressure, 1050 psi. Temperature, 390 degrees Fahrenheit. We're entering the peak threshold zone, David announced to the room, his voice loud and confident. As you can see, the Horizon Dynamics Apex model handles the thermal variance with zero structural degradation. We are ready for global scaling. The investors clapped lightly. Elias just took a slow sip of his black coffee. I stepped closer to the glass. I leaned my forehead against the cool polycarbonate. I didn't look at the digital readout. I didn't need to. I watched the lower housing bracket of the valve. It's starting, I whispered to Elias. What am I looking at? Elias asked, his eyes narrowing. The lower left seal joint, I said. Watch the paint. At 420 degrees, industrial paint doesn't just peel. It micro-blisters. It happens in a fraction of a second. A tiny, almost imperceptible ripple across the dark gray surface. It was the physical manifestation of the internal housing, warping against the steel casing. The seals were locking up. The pressure was backing up into the main line, but the digital telemetry, pulling from the outer sensors, hadn't caught the differential yet. Pressure, 1150 psi. Temperature, 430 degrees Fahrenheit. Then the sound changed. It wasn't a loud noise. It was a high-pitched, metallic whine, like a dog whistle for engineers. It was the sound of high-carbon steel crying out as its molecular structure was pushed past its absolute yield point. Down on the floor, the head technician suddenly sat up straight in the control booth. He tapped his monitor furiously. The automated voice over the PA system stuttered. Warning, internal thermal differential anomaly detected. Core temperature exceeding threshold. David frowned. He looked back at the control booth and made a frantic rolling motion with his hand, silently telling the tech to push through, to ignore the warning. He didn't want the test to abort in front of $12 million. He's overriding the safety cutoff, I said, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. He's an idiot. Let him, Elias said softly. It's his signature on the liability waiver. Pressure, 1200 psi. Temperature, 450 degrees Fahrenheit. The digital readout flashed red. The metallic whine escalated into a horrific grinding shriek. The entire massive test rig began to shake violently, the heavy bolts securing it to the concrete floor vibrating loose. Shut it down, the lead investor yelled, his fleece vest suddenly looking very thin. Shut the damn thing down. David turned pale. He lunged toward the communication console. Abort. Cut the main feed. But you cannot simply tell 450 degrees of superheated, highly pressurized steam to stop. You have to vent it. You have to guide it. And the apex valve 3.8 was officially locked solid. The internal warping had sealed the exit port. The valve was no longer a regulator. It was a plug. Let me be clear about what mechanical failure looks like in high-pressure systems. It is not like the movies. There is no countdown timer. There is no dramatic pause. There is just physics reasserting its dominance over human arrogance. When the microfracture appeared, I watched David's face. The arrogance drained out of him, replaced instantly by the stark, helpless terror of a man who suddenly realizes he is not the smartest person in the room. He had spent his entire life manipulating people, manipulating spreadsheets, manipulating board votes. But you cannot manipulate 1,000 pounds of steam pressure. It doesn't care about your venture capital pitch. It doesn't care about your tailored suit. I looked at the lead investor. The man had dropped his branded water bottle. His hands were pressed flat against the blast glass, his eyes wide. These were men who built their fortunes on the concept of fail fast, iterate later. It is a very cute philosophy when you are building software. It is a terrifying, potentially lethal philosophy when you are building industrial machinery. The hissing sound from the floor grew deafening. The digital readout screen shorted out in a shower of sparks, the telemetry failing entirely. The safety valves on the main supply line were trying to slam shut, but the back pressure from the ruined Apex prototype was fighting the automated system. "It's going to blow," someone screamed in the back of the observation deck. The crowd surged toward the heavy steel exit doors, a chaotic tangle of expensive suits and panicked shouting. Elias and I didn't run. We stood near the back wall, out of the direct line of sight of the blast glass, watching the inevitable conclusion of David's ambition. I crossed my arms over my faded flannel shirt. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt a heavy, profound exhaustion. This was my design, my life's work, being mutilated because an 18-year-old boy I tried to save had grown up into a man who refused to learn patience. Down in the bay, the microfracture expanded with a sickening crack that reverberated through the concrete walls, and the heavy steel housing of the apex valve split violently open. The concussive wave didn't shatter the blast-resistant polycarbonate, but the physical force of it hit the glass so hard that the heavy steel window frames groaned. It felt like being punched in the chest by a ghost. Superheated steam violently expanded in a fraction of a second, blinding the entire testing bay in a dense, shrieking white cloud. The emergency automated venting system finally engaged, sounding like a dying jet turbine as it frantically sucked the aerosolized moisture through the roof scrubbers. Down below, when the thick fog finally began to thin, the physical reality of the situation became visible. The apex valve 3.8 was completely unrecognizable. The half-inch thick, high-carbon steel housing was peeled back and jagged, resembling a discarded, violently torn orange rind. Heavy metal shrapnel was embedded an inch deep into the reinforced concrete walls. The internal seals had melted into useless puddles of black slag. Millions of dollars of venture capital potential reduced to absolute scrap in less than 4 minutes. Nobody said anything for a while. The silence in the observation deck was deafening, broken only by the automated warning klaxons blaring down on the floor. The lead investor from California was standing perfectly still. He slowly reached up and brushed a fine layer of dust off the shoulder of his branded fleece vest. His face was the color of wet ash. He turned slowly toward my nephew. "You told my tech analysts this design was flawless," the investor said. His voice wasn't a yell. It was a cold, flat razor blade. "You told me we were ready for global scaling, David." David couldn't speak. His jaw was doing that slow grinding thing, but his lips were parted in shock. He stared through the glass at the ruined metal, his hands visibly shaking. He looked like a little boy who had just broken his father's favorite watch and was waiting for the punishment. Within 10 minutes, the entire remaining group was corralled into a sterile, poorly lit conference room down the hall from the observation deck. It smelled like industrial floor cleaner and stale coffee. There was a single plastic tray of untouched finger sandwiches sitting in the middle of a cheap folding table. Grounding details like that always stand out when everything else is falling apart. The 5 venture capitalists sat on one side of the table. David sat on the other, flanked by 2 of his newly appointed board members, who suddenly looked like they deeply regretted their career choices. Elias and I stood in the back corner of the room, near a humming vending machine. We were just observers, until we weren't. "We are pulling the 12 million, the lead investor said, tossing a thick legal folder onto the table. "Immediately. And we are initiating a forensic audit of Horizon Dynamics to recover the initial seed money you've already burned. This was a catastrophic failure. You misrepresented the viability of the core product." David finally found his voice. It was high, thin, and desperate. "Wait, please, wait. It wasn't a conceptual failure. It was sabotage. The design was tampered with." He turned around in his chair and pointed directly at me. His eyes were wide and wild. He did it, my uncle. He was bitter about the restructuring. He left a corrupted file on the server on purpose to destroy the company. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I just walked slowly from the back of the room toward the table. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. I stopped opposite David. It wasn't sabotage, David, I said quietly. It was physics. You altered the CAD files. He yelled, his composure completely dissolving. You broke the math. The math was perfectly fine for what it was, I replied, reaching into my pocket and rubbing the cold steel gear of my calipers. But you didn't build a finished product. You built version 3.8. You built a rough draft. The lead investor leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. A rough draft? Your documentation stated the apex valve was fully stress-tested and ready for production. His documentation lied, I said, looking directly at the investor. Or rather, it assumed I designed that valve. I also discovered the fatal thermal retention flaw in the lower housing bracket 3 days before David orchestrated my hostile termination. I noted it in my private journal. I hadn't updated the central servers yet, because I hadn't finalized the solution. David just grabbed whatever was in the folder and ran to the bank. You knew it would explode, David whispered, his face twisting with a mixture of betrayal and horror. You let me stand up there and I let you launch exactly what you stole. I interrupted, my voice dropping an octave. You wanted to be the smartest guy in the room. You wanted to move fast and break things. Well, congratulations. You broke it. The room went dead silent. The truth of the situation settled heavily over the folding table. The venture capitalists realized they had backed a charismatic fraud who didn't understand the machinery he was selling. So the apex valve is dead, the investor said flatly, leaning back. 35 years of engineering reputation completely wasted. No, Elias said. It was the first time my lawyer had spoken since we entered the room. He stepped forward, setting his chipped ceramic mug down on the table, next to the untouched sandwiches. He opened his worn leather briefcase and pulled out a single, heavily stamped legal document. He slid it across the table toward the lead investor. The apex valve is entirely salvageable, Elias said smoothly. In fact, it can easily handle 1500 psi with zero thermal degradation. It just requires a proprietary titanium bypass chamber to route the excess heat away from the primary seals. David stared at the document. What is that? That, Elias said, is United States Patent Number 11,842,901, filed independently by Marcus 3 months ago, approved and expedited. The investor picked up the document. He read the summary paragraph. Then he looked at me. You hold the patent for the fix. I own the only breathing apparatus that stops your investment from choking to death, I said. Horizon Dynamics owns a flawed, highly dangerous piece of steel. I own the cure. I mean that literally. You cannot manufacture the apex valve without infringing on my intellectual property. I watched David's face collapse. I mean physically collapse. The tension in his jaw vanished. His shoulders slumped, and the reality of his profound miscalculation finally crushed him. He had spent months manipulating board votes to steal a locked box, completely unaware that I had kept the only key in my pocket. But I wasn't finished. Cleverness is fast. What I do is slow, and I had been planning this cut for 3 months. Here is the thing, I said, addressing the investors. I know you want this technology. It works. It will revolutionize geothermal tapping, but you are currently bound to a CEO who cannot distinguish between a minor mechanical variance and a lethal pressure bomb. You cannot trust him, but you can trust me. What are you proposing? The lead investor asked, his eyes narrowing with a predator's curiosity. I have formed a new entity, Apex Engineering LLC, I said. I am willing to exclusively license the bypass chamber patent to Horizon Dynamics. It will save your $12 million investment. It will make the valve function perfectly, but my licensing fee isn't cash. David looked up, his eyes bloodshot. What do you want, Uncle Marcus? I looked at the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle. I looked at the man who had fired me from my own life's work. I want 52% of Horizon Dynamics voting shares transferred immediately to my LLC, I said quietly. I want full, uncontested operational control of the R&D and manufacturing divisions. And I want your immediate, irrevocable resignation as CEO effective the moment the ink dries. You can't do that, David stammered, looking at his board members. They can't force me out. Actually, they can, Elias interjected, tapping the legal folder the investors had thrown on the table earlier. The emergency clause in your VC funding agreement states that in the event of gross negligence or a catastrophic failure during auditing, the primary investors have the right to demand a change in executive leadership to protect their capital. A failed public test resulting in shrapnel embedded in a concrete wall qualifies as gross negligence. Elias looked at the lead investor. We had a lovely phone call with your legal team yesterday morning. I believe they already reviewed our licensing proposal. Done? The investor looked at me, looked at the ruined metal through the distant doors, and then looked at David. Done, the investor said. The scratch of a pen on heavy legal paper is an incredibly quiet sound, but in that sterile conference room, it echoed like a gavel striking a block. David didn't argue anymore. He didn't have the leverage, and more importantly, he didn't have the energy. The sheer kinetic shock of seeing his unearned arrogance physically detonate behind a wall of blast glass had completely hollowed him out. He picked up the cheap plastic pen Elias slid across the folding table. His hand trembled slightly. He signed his resignation. He signed the transfer of voting shares. He signed away the illusion of the empire he thought he had stolen from me. The venture capitalists packed up their briefcases with practiced, ruthless efficiency. They didn't offer David a handshake. They didn't even look at him. To them, he was no longer a young visionary. He was a bad investment, a rounding error they had narrowly avoided. They nodded at me, shook Elias's hand, and walked out the door, already discussing their dinner reservations in downtown Detroit. When they were gone, it was just the three of us left in the room. Elias, me, and the boy I had taught how to hold a wrench. David stared at the plastic tray of untouched finger sandwiches. He looked incredibly small in his custom-tailored charcoal suit. I thought I was doing the right thing for the company, David whispered to the empty room. I thought you were just afraid of the future, Uncle Marcus. I thought I was fixing your mistakes. I know you did, David, I said softly. That was the problem. You thought a company was just numbers on a spreadsheet. You forgot that underneath every single number is a piece of steel under immense pressure. If you don't respect the steel, the numbers don't matter. They never did. I didn't yell. I didn't lecture him. I just turned and walked out of the room, leaving him sitting there in the fluorescent hum. Elias followed me. We walked back out to the parking lot. The cold Michigan air hit my face, and for the first time in 3 months, I felt my shoulders drop. I didn't realize how tightly I had been holding myself together until the tension finally bled out of me. We got into my 1998 Ford 150. The engine turned over with a heavy, reliable rumble. You did good, Marcus, Elias said, pulling his seatbelt across his tweed jacket. Clean, legal, and absolute. I don't feel good, Elias, I replied, putting the truck into gear. I feel tired. That means you're human, he said, staring out the window at the massive concrete bunker. Only sociopaths smile after a funeral. The cleanup took exactly 2 weeks. My first act as the reinstated CEO and majority owner of Horizon Dynamics was not a grand speech or a press conference. I walked into the Human Resources Department, fired the 5 external board members David had brought in, and voided their severance packages under the gross negligence clause we had triggered. They threatened to sue. Elias sent them a single, beautifully drafted 2-page letter detailing their legal exposure in the failed Detroit stress test. I never heard from them again. My second act was to pick up the phone and call Frank. I offered him his job back as lead foreman, along with the other 2 senior machinists David had discarded. I'd bumped their salaries by 15%. Retroactive to the day they were terminated. Frank didn't say much on the phone. He just asked what time the morning shift started. I told him 6 a.m., just like it always did. Returning to my office felt strange. The space had been scrubbed of my history. The framed photograph of my brother Thomas was gone, replaced by a massive abstract painting that looked like someone had thrown a bucket of gray paint at a white canvas. I took the painting down immediately. I brought my photograph back from my garage and set it on the mahogany desk. I sat in the leather chair, looking at Thomas's young, arrogant face, and I wondered what he would think of what I had just done to his only son. David came in on a Thursday evening to clear out the executive suite. The building was mostly empty. The heavy CNC lathes on the shop floor were silent for the night. I stood in the doorway of his office, watching him pack a cardboard box. He took down his expensive degrees. He packed a sleek, minimalist desk clock. He didn't have any tools to pack. He had never needed them. He taped the box shut and finally looked at me. The anger was gone from his eyes, replaced by a dull, bruised resignation. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice flat. "Now you go find another job," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "You are smart, David. You know supply chains. You know how to talk to the suits. You will land on your feet somewhere. Just don't let them put you near the engineering department." He offered a weak, bitter half-smile. "Are you going to press charges for the files?" "No," I said. "You didn't steal the intellectual property that mattered, and you signed away the company. We are legally severed. I have no interest in ruining your life any further. You did a fine job of that yourself." He picked up the box. He walked toward the door, forcing me to step aside so he could pass. He stopped right next to me in the hallway. I could smell his expensive cologne, sharp and entirely out of place in a manufacturing plant. "I really did think you were holding us back," he said quietly, looking straight ahead. "I wasn't trying to destroy you. I was trying to win." "I know," I said. "But in this business, winning isn't about moving the fastest. It's about surviving the pressure. Goodbye, David." He nodded once, heavily, and walked down the long corridor toward the elevator. I didn't watch him leave the building. I didn't go to the window to watch him load his car. I just went back down to the R&D lab, turned on the overhead desk lamp, and opened my leather journal. There was work to do. 6 months have passed since that day in Detroit. Horizon Dynamics is quiet again. We aren't making headlines in venture capital magazines, and we aren't promising to disrupt the global energy paradigm by next quarter. We are just building heavy, unglamorous things that work exactly the way they are supposed to. The apex valve, retrofitted with my patented titanium bypass chamber, passed its final independent stress certification last month. It held a sustained pressure of 1,500 psi at 460 degrees Fahrenheit for 72 straight hours. It didn't warp. It didn't whistle. It just functioned. We secured a massive 10-year procurement contract with a European geothermal conglomerate based entirely on the boring, predictable reliability of that test. I still meet Elias for breakfast every other Tuesday at the small diner on Walthy Street. He still drinks his black coffee from that chipped ceramic mug. Last week, over cold wheat toast, he asked me if I had heard from David. "No," I told him, stirring my coffee, "and I don't expect to." Elias watched me for a moment. "You missed the kid." It wasn't a question, so I didn't answer it immediately. I looked out the diner window at the gray Michigan morning. "I miss the boy who used to sweep the floors and ask me how the machines worked," I said finally. "I don't know the man who tried to sell my life's work to strangers. I don't regret what I did, Elias. I regret that I had to do it. There's a difference." "I know," Elias said gently, "but the firm is safe. The legacy is safe. You built a wall he couldn't climb over." "I didn't build a wall," I replied. "I just let him build his own trap, and I refused to give him the key. Family is a complicated mechanism. It is supposed to be the strongest alloy in your life, the thing that holds up under the maximum thermal load of existence. But sometimes there is a hidden fracture, a microscopic flaw in the grain of the metal that you cannot see until the pressure spikes. When that happens, you have a choice. You can let the whole system explode, taking you down with it, or you can cleanly sever the bad part to save the rest of the machine. It is a brutal calculation. It leaves a scar. But you do it because the alternative is complete destruction. We are civil now, David and I, at least in the silent, distant way that estranged relatives are civil. We don't speak, but we don't bleed onto each other anymore either. That has to be enough. If you like this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of this sphere. I am back in the shop now. It is late. The building is empty, just the low hum of the ventilation system keeping me company. I stand at my old workbench, wearing my faded flannel shirt. I reach into my breast pocket and pull out my Mitutoyo calipers. My thumb finds the small, familiar gear. I slide the stainless steel jaws open, feeling the perfectly smooth, machined resistance. I look at the tiny, almost invisible scratch near the 2-inch mark. It reminds me that nothing is ever truly perfect, that everything carries a little bit of damage from the impacts of the past, but it still reads true to the thousandth of a millimeter. I put the calipers back in my pocket. I turn on the heavy CNC lathe. Not to make anything tonight, just to stand in the warm ozone-scented air and listen to the steady, unbreakable rhythm of the machine.